Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the YMyHealth podcast. I am Julie Woon, and today joining me is Rebecca Lipsky. You might recognize her from some of our previous episodes about mental health and wellness. And she is a licensed therapist who specializes in grief and trauma. And today she's here to share her insights on how to care for your mental and emotional health during the holidays, especially when you might be, navigating loss or some major life changes. Holiday blues can be really true for some people. And so we wanted to talk through a little bit about that ahead of the holiday season. So welcome back, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you again.
Likewise. So I want to get started with just talking about maybe like a quick framing. So the holidays are often described as time of joy and togetherness, but for some of those who might be grieving, it can be a really, really difficult time of the year as well. And so, from your perspective, why is this time so specifically a period when you can feel amplified feelings of, loss or grief?
For sure. So I think a couple things. So one, holidays are very much a built-in anniversary, right? So whether it's, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is the first Christmas without grandpa, or because we can talk about this, of course, later, but there's both death and non-death losses. It might also be, wow, I can't believe this is the fifth holiday that we haven't been in our home that burned down, right? So it kind of just acts as a marker of time as it relates to losses. So I think it really can turn the volume up on our grief. But like you said, there's also just a lot of common tropes around the holiday season of cheer, joy, togetherness. And they are, of course, well-meaning, but I think sometimes, unfortunately, it can be inadvertently invalidating if people are feeling anything but the cheer and joy. And as it relates to the loss of a person, whether it is via death or not a death, like you said, the togetherness is always a very promoted thing. So it's also tough when you're not together with a person that you otherwise would wish to be. So I think, yeah, it can kind of amplify all of that. Not to mention, it also comes during the colder, darker, earlier season,
Yes,
which is its own layer. But
totally. Yeah, that seasonal depression can definitely get you. I know, definitely in the past for me it has. So,
mhm,
um, you touched on you know, different types of grief or different types of loss. And I think
mhm.
it'd be interesting to hear you talk a little bit about this because, like you said, a lot of times what first comes to mind, I think, for people is death or the loss of someone um, in that form. And so, can you expand a little bit on these other forms of grief that maybe don't initially come to mind, but are things that you've seen?
Yeah, for sure. So, first, just want to explain how grief itself is the internal experience relating to a loss. So, really, the thoughts and feelings that you have regarding a loss. And mourning actually is kind of that outward expression of our grief. So that could be somebody crying, that could be someone engaging in memorialization ritual. So that grief is what we're experiencing in relation to the loss, whether it is from a death or non death. But yeah, I think loss is much more widely spoken to in the context of death. And I'll also tell you that in my field, like in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, grief is actually only discussed as it relates to death too. So even clinically, we are needing like a huge update there.
Wow.
Um, but yeah, so of course, death losses can relate to any relationship of a person to you who unfortunately has passed away. But non-death loss can be still the loss of a person, but maybe by breakup or separation, friendship loss, a family estrangement, fertility losses, etc., but also can be non-interpersonal. So the loss of a home, financial loss, loss of cognitive functioning, loss of physical functioning. I've seen that a lot too, like if people are diagnosed with some illness. So there's just so many different ways that we can experience loss. So I think to really name that outside of the scope of death is so important too, because I mean, grieving can be such an isolating experience to begin with, but when our form of grief isn't named as much, if it's non-death, that can really amplify that feeling of isolation too when we're just not hearing it be talked about enough, so.
Absolutely. I guess you mentioned the mourning is the external piece, grief is the internal piece. For both, are there common either emotions that people are feeling or expressions of those emotions that we might experience if it's, whether it's ourselves or somebody who's close to us?
Yeah, so some common emotions that accompany grief can be sadness, anger, depending on the loss, shock, confusion. Guilt is quite common, especially around holiday time as well, right? If it's like, how are we all laughing and eating this meal together and this person's not here? Loneliness, like I mentioned. But something I want to normalize too is that joy and grief can sometimes exist simultaneously. And so, even to take a holiday example, if like two parents are experiencing the first Thanksgiving without their son because their son is at their new partner's family's house, right? So they might feel so happy and grateful that their child has found a partner with such a welcoming family, while also feeling this loss that they're not there and it's not like the usual holiday traditions as it was. So sometimes there can be a little confusing mix of both.
Yeah.
Um, Denial can accompany it as well. So I mean, there's so many different kinds of emotions. But with that mourning piece too, everybody can then express that or cope with that very, very differently. But those internal pieces, I'd say, are more universal.
Yeah. And how can the pressure to, be merry or be happy, like you mentioned before, or keep up with some kind of traditions intensify those feelings?
For sure. So kind of like I said before, I do think it can inadvertently invalidate all of those painful emotions, but I think it can also cause resentment, right? Of just like this unfairness that I've got to like keep up appearances, which nobody has to do. But like you said, there can be pressure to do so. And so I think what that also can be a risk of is people not necessarily meeting themselves where they're at. Right. So feeling like, okay, I am experiencing all this pain on the inside, but like it's the holidays and I'm being told to put on a happy face. And so we then kind of fall out of alignment with showing up for ourselves in regards to what we're really needing. So I think, yeah, that kind of like, this is the time of year where you're supposed to feel this way and act this way. There is no one size fits all. That is not always going to match up for us.
Yeah. And I guess kind of leading right off the back of that, are there misconceptions about grief, especially around like how long it should last or what it should look like that you
Mhm.
wish more people understood?
Yeah. So a few different things. So I'm going to name drop a few people, but just to speak to like different people's theories. So I
Good.
think a lot of people are familiar with like 5 stages of grief, which was theorized by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I do want to say that I think the 5 stages of grief does provide some benefit to the processing of grief. I think it really helps provide language to some experiences. But I think the misconception with it is that it's a very linear process. There's a start, like a clear start and end. Once you complete one phase, that's done. You're not going to feel it again. And that's not how it works. And I'm honestly on a mission to create a new saying to grief is not linear because it is very cliche, and I always say cliche things are that way because they're true. But I know some people scoff at that saying because they hear it all the time, but it really, really isn't. And so I want people to understand that grief is a very oscillating process. It's not even about, oh, I've made progress, but whoa, now I'm having a bad day, so I've totally regressed. It's just each day can look a bit different. So really that there is kind of this fluidity to it and not a very cut and dry it starts here and it ends there. It is I mean, grief really can it is a lifelong experience. It's just the different ways that we experience it and how we relate to it and um the version of it and the space it's taking up in our lives is what really changes. And so I guess using that as a segue into someone else's theory, it's called Tonkin's model of grief, and there's different ways it's illustrated. I'll kind of describe my favorite one that I like to show clients. I'm going to do my best to describe it. So please clarify if you need to. But so there's two rows. Both rows have jars with a ball in it. We as humans are the jar. The ball inside the jar is our grief or our pain. And so on the top row is three jars the same size. And then in the first jar, it's a really large ball. And then the ball shrinks, like in each of the three ones. And so it says on the figure, like people tend to think that grief shrinks over time. And then on the second row, it says, but what it actually is that we grow around our grief. So the second row illustrates three jars, but the jars actually get bigger in size and the ball itself stays the same time because what it's really conveying is how grief is an integrating process. It's not something that we shrink. It's not something that we're trying to get out of the jar. I know so badly we wish we could. I, of course, want to validate that. Unfortunately, it's just not how it works. But when we really can think of it as this reconciliation or this integration and how we have to make space for it, and we can do so by still letting ourselves live and finding meaning even after a loss, is a huge thing that I love to clarify with people about what the process really is.
Yeah, I think that's a great, like, visual example of doing that, and one that I hadn't personally heard before, so I really like that. I think it's a great way to put it in perspective. Are for people who are coping, with grief or loss during this holiday season, what are some healthy ways to cope, um, with that, especially if your emotions are feeling maybe a little unpredictable?
Mhm. Well, so I first always want to encourage people to really use what works for them. So, for example, if somebody finds a lot of catharsis through writing, turn to writing. If someone's, well, writing can be creative too, but if someone's creative in a more like visual art way, they can turn to art or create music. If people enjoy nature, right? So I think I always like to say, as long as it's healthy and safe, there's so many different things that people can turn to. And I really, really want people to honor what works for them. I think when it comes to loss, right, depending on whether it's a person or not a person, there's something really powerful with how we continue a bond with the person or thing that we've lost. So I think especially around the holiday time, maybe for one person that looks like making grandma's favorite well, honestly, I can speak to personal example. I unfortunately did recently lose an aunt, and this will be our first holiday season without her. And specifically on Thanksgiving, she made this delicious dessert, a strawberry fluff. And one of my cousins actually has the recipe and has baked it before, right? So we have yet to experience this holiday without her. Of course, well, I guess this will come out after Thanksgiving, but um, so making the dish that the deceased loved and they made. Sometimes that can look like lighting a candle in their honor. Sometimes that can look like playing their favorite song for like 3 minutes of the dinner, whatever it is. Or the day of a holiday, maybe on the way to your family house, it's stopping at the cemetery to visit the grave, right? So I think so that's of course with people. If it's losing a house, maybe it's driving by, the house or at least just the general neighborhood. So I encourage people to find their own ways of continuing bonds because just because the thing has been lost doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be an attachment to it anymore. It's just that it's going to be a different version of the attachment. But then, of course, sometimes just on the, like, emotional piece, if there's a lot of anxiety that's coming up or a lot of distress or fear, whatever it is, I think, in addition to those coping strategies, there's also just a lot of power in turning to some body based methods, otherwise known as somatic tools, that can really just help with like regulating the intensity of the emotion. Of course, again, another cliche, but it's cliche because it genuinely scientifically works, is engaging in deep breathing, because it helps activate our parasympathetic nervous system, which starts to calm us down. But I think, yeah, just turning to different tools that someone can have in the toolbox to, depending on what emotion they're sensing, it could be that anger, to turn to different things that can really help just soften it so that it just feels a bit more manageable to ride the wave of the feeling. Nobody needs to avoid it, nobody needs to suppress it. It's just how someone can help themselves better move through it as it validly shows up.
Definitely. I think, sorry for your loss,
Thank you.
also. She sounds really lovely. I think, yeah, just having those traditions or those, like, new pieces that you can have to honor that person during that period of time is really lovely. And I like these sort of, like, mindfulness and, like, grounding techniques if things start to feel very overwhelming. Um, I am curious if you think there's any time when it's valid to maybe just take a step back? I know we highlighted the grief never leaves us, but when maybe that loss is much fresher,
Mhm,
what does that look like? If there is a, potentially like a need or a reason to step away, and how do you kind of tell those around you, "Hey, like, this is maybe gonna be too much for me this year, and I need to take some time."
mhm. For sure. So, like I had mentioned before, and of course, I'll always stand by this, the way out of the immense pain is through it. However, that doesn't mean we need to swallow ourselves whole in the pain at one time, especially like you said, when it's really fresh. So it is okay. I would always check in on this with a client and I can kind of distinguish between when they're really avoiding it or when it's just like, that's a bit too much for me today, or that's a bit too much for me right now. And of course, every individual kind of senses that differently, but I do really want to normalize that that is okay. So whether that looks like only staying 2 hours at a holiday versus 4 hours, maybe that looks like, I mean, if it's preparing for the holiday, right? And it's just like, I'm feeling really, really sad. I'm feeling really guilty. I don't have it in me to cook an elaborate 5 hour meal. Then, like, allowing yourself to just order takeout or have people help you out a bit more. But yeah, I think I talk with people a lot about kind of frequency and intensity when it comes to really measuring how painful something is and how much it's interfering, right? And so sometimes, right, it's work to bring down that intensity. So, of course, I mentioned some of those, yeah, grounding and mindfulness techniques in a moment of a painful emotion, but this can also look like a modification in how somebody's approaching a day, right? So, if it's like, if you know that on the holiday, you guys always listen to Mariah Carey music all day long, but that was your mom's favorite music, then we can really dose that out, right? And if you feel like you still want to honor that, but not listen to the whole album, what are our options here? Well, one modification is maybe we just pull out the album and we put it on the table and call it a day. Maybe we pick two songs from the album that we're going to listen to. Maybe we just read the lyrics of it, right? So I love to show, I sometimes I think of it as an accordion. Like if we were just kind of spread all this out, there's really so many different versions of still something that you've done to honor a person that can in this moment or on this day feel more manageable and palatable so that people feel like it doesn't even need to be all or nothing. If one day it is nothing, okay, but there's so many options for something. I think that helps people feel a little more in control and a little more, um, feeling like they can honor their grief, but do so in a way that's not going to break them on that
Yeah,
day.
definitely. And we've talked a lot from the side of, you know, the person who is grieving or who, is mourning this loss. If you're a friend or a family member who has somebody, in your midst during the holidays who is grieving, what are some meaningful ways to support that person during that time? Um, and is there anything that you should avoid doing as well?
Mhm. So to start with the second part first, I think as far as what can be unhelpful, I mean, for any of it, like there's no one size fits all, but it's really, I think, for the unhelpful piece, so, person dependent. Some people are really faith-based, which is really beautiful, and so some people might really benefit from hearing they're in a better place right now or everything happens for a reason. But I know other people who absolutely hate to hear that. So I think you have to just know kind of who you're working with and what their connection is, but also know that those are not one size fits all phrases. I think as far as what is helpful, I say this about a lot of things, and I, of course, want to acknowledge that some of the onus here is on the person in pain to share what's helpful to them and what they need. But I get that that can be so hard when you can't even see past the next hour of the day. So I think to really check in with the person grieving as to what is beneficial for them or what they feel they need. So, for example, do you want to talk about the person today? Do you want to share funny stories of them? Do you just want to look at photos of them? Do you not want to talk about it, but want to have, take a stroll to, the park that you guys used to visit for Sunday afternoon every day, whatever it is. So, again, knowing that sometimes support can be spoken, sometimes it can just be showing up alongside somebody when they face their grief or pain in a particular way. But again, you do have to know the players.
Yeah,
So it's hard to give like a full concrete answer, but those are some things that come to mind.
definitely. And when it's maybe grief that's happening within a group, so maybe that's familial, maybe it's a friend group, partners, where everyone has, experienced a loss, but they're experiencing it differently. How do you handle when, maybe people's timeline is different or their level of like grief and mourning is different within the group, but the loss is in theory the same?
Yeah, I mean
Heavy
that's
quotation marks.
sure, sure, sure. It's such a good question because it is very common for everybody to experience the loss differently. And so, again, going back to that grief and mourning difference, the grief is covert, right? So, we don't know necessarily that someone is feeling guilty unless they tell us, or we don't know that someone's feeling really angry about it. But we all express it and show it differently. And also, people might be at different phases of what they're feeling emotionally. So I think it's really important within the group. I get it can be easier said than done, but really, really to respect and understand that there is no one size fits all. And everybody has a different process. That doesn't mean one is right or wrong. And so it's, if it's a family or if it's a group or friends, I know these aren't the most comfortable topics to discuss amongst each other, but maybe it is helpful, for everybody to share what is helpful to their process so that there can be an understanding because we don't want to meet somebody with like, I can't believe it's been 5 months and you haven't cried once yet. Where that does not mean this person's not sad about it, right? Or I can't believe it's been 5 months and you haven't visited the cemetery yet. Okay, that doesn't mean this person's not memorializing the loss in their own way or not coping with the feelings that are hindering them from visiting the cemetery if they eventually want to. So, I think really just knowing that everybody's process is different, both as far as what it looks like on the outside, what each person on a given day is feeling on the inside, and just the pacing and timeline of how everybody moves through that. But yeah, I think that's a great question because it's very common and a tough thing to navigate, especially when there is such power in sameness and commonality. So, like you said, when somebody has or a group has lost the same thing or the same person, but it all spreads out very differently amongst each other. That can create its own isolation amongst a shared experience.
Yeah. And what does, hope look like in the context of grief? Like, you know, maybe this is the first holiday season where they're managing this grief, and like I think a lot of people do get a sense of just like, is it always going to be like this? And so,
Mhm,
what do you tell your clients when they're trying to kind of look for something future wise as far
mhm.
as management of those feelings?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that hope is a really beautiful thing to connect with as a future oriented outlook and emotion. And I know that it can be really hard to do so when life has completely been upended and there's a lot about the future that's unknown. And so I first and foremost always love to normalize how I'm not here to create false hope that I am going to bring back. Of course, I can't bring back the person or some of the things that they've lost, but that I'm not here to bring back life exactly as it was to them. How can we? And that's of course a difficult conversation, but to really discuss that it is so possible, very difficult and still possible to create a new version of fulfillment or a new version of joy in one's life or purpose that again integrates the loss into that future picture. And so we can sometimes talk about different examples, but I think not trying to make it all sound like, okay, yes, it's all going to go back to the way it was. I think it actually really helps my clients when we have that other part of the conversation so that people know, okay, yes, I can't even fathom it being the same way. I don't even want it to be. But okay, there's alternative ways that I can keep putting one foot in front of the other in my life. I do a lot of values work to help people really like come back home to themselves, to connect with what matters to them, what's important in their life, to really help them find meaning again. It is challenging, though, of course, but I think also in that conversation can bring up resilience factors that each client possesses as it relates to past pain and hardship that they've gone through, even if it wasn't a significant loss, to still show, hey, life was once this way, you experienced this challenge, or maybe referencing another loss if there was one and can really pull from the strengths that they possessed in that journey and how they still have it, right? It's just how do we have it show up to this new situation?
Yeah. I like what you mentioned about, earlier on, these sort of like new traditions, and it's never going to be the same after that loss, but like that there's these other things that you can kind of bring into the picture that um help with that like resiliency and honoring that memory or that space. I think that's really like a great way to do it. I'm curious too, if for listeners who are maybe struggling right now, if there was like one key takeaway of what you would recommend as we move through the holiday season, what that might be.
Well, I always first and foremost do promote self compassion, which is our ability to, through challenging and difficult times, show up for ourselves in a gentle and kind way. I always tell people that self compassion doesn't need to be fake. So we don't need to say, like, oh my God, yes, girl, you crushed the day, if that's not how you feel. It could
Yep.
be genuine to where you're at. And I also like to tell people that self compassion is not about free passes or promoting complacency, right? So we can still be encouraging to ourselves. But I think especially when we're going through a significant loss, we don't want to then lose ourselves. And we lose ourselves when we go against ourselves or we go to war with ourselves, and it can kind of rupture what we've got going with ourselves. So as a way to join in and be on the same team as us, whether that's validating our emotion or really connecting with what we're needing, I think just across the board is a really important foundation. Um, and I think also I just want to reemphasize that point about the integration and the growing around the grief to like really stick that landing on what the grief journey and what the process of it really does involve. And that while I know it's so easy to just wish that it could all go away, and I hate to say that it can't, we really can find ways to make space for it. And the more we try to push it out, like this unchangeable thing, the resistance is just going to amplify the pain. But the acceptance is in the unchangeable. But acceptance is not about leaving changeable things unchanged, right? So, in that forward movement, right, there's a lot of room to play there with air quotes play, as far as how we can make those modifications moving
Mm.
forward.
And, you've kind of given us some, like, visual examples and talked about some
Mhm.
other frameworks that you've, leveraged in the past when talking through this. Are there any other resources, whether that's, like, books or organizations, practices that you would recommend for listeners who are interested in diving a little bit deeper on this subject?
Yeah, well, so I have two people I like to always recommend. So, one is David Kessler. He is an author. He's authored many books about grief. He has a podcast that I think is just called Healing with David Kessler. I could definitely check that real quick, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And he has unfortunately gone through some very significant losses within his immediate family. I think he just speaks, of course, from personal experience, but really in such like a kind, compassionate, pragmatic way. So I really do recommend his work. And again, if you like books, he's got them. If you like to listen, he's got a podcast. And then I also love Gina Maffa, who is also a licensed therapist, also based in New York. Um, she's also gone through a significant loss in her immediate family. She's written a book called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, which is fantastic. She has been a guest on many podcasts. She also has, well, they both have Instagram accounts if anyone's on social media, but she posts a lot. I think the way she words things is really incredible, and every time I read her stuff, I'm like, that's it. Like that is there's no other way to say it. So those are two people that I love to recommend. And again, you can kind of get that content in a few different forms.
Excellent. And is there anything today that I haven't asked or we haven't touched on that you think is important to highlight?
Ooh, I mean, you've asked great questions. I think I might have said this before, but again, I just really want to encourage people to meet themselves where they're at. Again, we can feel, yes, of course, holidays, but even just the way grief is discussed pretty widely, it is this like, okay, like, how are we not over it? Like, how are we still crying about this? And like, I just, we got to wipe that off the table. That is not how it goes. And so I don't want anybody to feel like they're behind because they're still having tough days about it. That is part of it. We can all be 80 years old and some song plays and it reminds us of a sad moment from when we're 8 years old, having nothing to do with the loss. Like I lost a soccer game or something. And we can feel sad, right? Like we're walking history books. All of this lives inside of us. And so I think, again, the more that just generally we can accept that that is part of our makeup of being human, unfortunately and inevitably, we're going to experience pain and adversity. I'm so, so sorry, truly, to anybody listening who is navigating such a complicated loss. It's one of the most disruptive experiences that we can have as human beings in our lives. But once we can acknowledge and accept that unchangeable facet of being human, but know that again, where do we have room to change? Okay, it's how I talk to myself, it's how I relate to myself, it's how I show up for these thoughts and feelings inside of me that are paining me. It's how I modify what works for me now. That could change in a month, 6 months, 2 years, right? We're ever evolving. Just to meet yourself where you're at, because you know what you need, maybe more than you realize, and you deserve to meet those needs.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Again, it's been great to have you back here on the podcast for listeners who missed the first episode, where can they learn more about you or find you online?
Yeah, so I do have a website, www.rebeccalipskycounseling.com. I am on Instagram and TikTok because that is the way of the world these days. And my handle is Rebecca's Therapy Room on both of those. And that's probably it for now. But yeah, no, it was
Great.
so great to be back. I always enjoy these conversations.
Yes, same here. And for those of you listening, if you like today's episode, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, let us know, and let us know about other topics that you might be interested in hearing from Rebecca or any of our guests in the future. And uh, if you are experiencing grief during this holiday season, we're wishing you the best. We're sorry for your loss. And hopefully, this has been an episode that has really been meaningful and helpful for you. So, thanks again for tuning into the Why My Health podcast, and we will talk to you next time.